Sounds like Europe. Cross-border podcasting.
Hello and welcome to Sounds Like Europe, Cross-Border Podcasting, a project brought to you by WIPAD. I am your host, Javi Caminero. In this podcast, I have had the opportunity to learn about the actual work and state of the podcast industry in different parts of Europe, as you already know by now. We have met all kinds of markets that are in different stages. Some are more established, some are starting to gather momentum, and others are enjoying great success. This time, I wanted to find out what podcasts are like in a country that is close to a bigger neighbor with a common market and audience. This is the case of Austria, a country of about 9 million inhabitants that shares a border and a language with Germany. To find out how podcasts in Austria deal with this scenario, I'm joined by Milo Tesselaar, co-founder and owner of Oh Wow Podcast, one of Austria's leading podcast producers. Hello Milo, how are you? Welcome.
Hello Javi, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
First of all, just to let the audience know and so they can know you a bit better, what's your story and how did podcasts come to your life?
I did my first podcast 10 years ago, or 13 years ago, was a try. Actually, it was a podcast on the media industry in Austria. And I produced three episodes and then I stopped. It was an experiment basically and without persistence. And afterwards there was of course also I was a serial listener in 2016-17, the great storytelling true crime podcast from the US, and that kind of inspired me. And then there was my girlfriend who was just starting her podcast, her personal podcast, Jean's Heldinnen back then. So she was inviting and interviewing inspiring women. And out of this podcast basically grew our company today, which is called Oh Wow Podcasts, which I, to be precise, didn't co-found, but I'm a co-owner and member of the managing board, but more on the strategic level, not so operationally. We do three different activities. We produce our own podcasts. Mm-hmm. We have three active podcasts. One is a feminist magazine, audio magazine, around 15 minutes, comes weekly. And then we have a magazine for women and investing. So future wealth of individual wealth for young and older women. Mm-hmm. And then we have a third one which is into philosophy, so it's with an Austrian female philosopher. So based on my girlfriend's background and business partner, we have a certain feminist positioning with our company and with the podcasts we produce. But our main activity, of course, is as more of an agency in terms of we do our main revenue with corporate and branded podcasts, like podcast as a service for brands, companies, personal brands, organizations. And last part is we do bigger podcast productions like series in a cooperation and co-production with media companies.
Going back to your roots and how you began producing podcasts, when did to have the bigger picture in front of us, when did podcasts begin to be popular in Austria? I mean, once you started with that experiment you mentioned before, about 13 years ago, at that time, was it kind of normal in Austria to try and have a successful podcast? Or were you one of the first people to try it? How has the podcasting industry evolved there?
Yeah, so back then I was a very early bird in terms of the whole podcast idea. I was late, but back then, 20 years ago, it was more a nerd kind of thing. Mm-hmm. like 10, 13 years when I started my first podcast, it was still like a completely insider media, and no media company in Austria did do their podcasts. Also the public radio didn't do any podcasts. So it was like just I did experiment with the medium because I had an iPod. I wanted to try it out. I wanted to see how the medium works for me in terms of how it will develop, and to be there with practice very early. But I didn't stay with it. Also, there was not so much listeners to gain. And so in Austria, basically the landscape or the listener, the attention of potential listeners is just there since like the last 7-8 years. Very much since COVID it's skyrocketing. It's part of the mainstream media usage now. We have like around 30%, pretty similar the last 3 years. 30% of Austrian population is listening to podcasts at least once a month, surveyed by the Reuters Digital News Report each year. So this is that's happening, but it's happening just in the last years. So I guess Austria is not very special compared with other markets as well, where like you have the podcast branch more or less growing since 2017-18.
Yeah, I think those years were the years that when the industry started to gain some strength in many points in Europe. But as you said, it was definitely during COVID when everything gained popularity and helped transform this medium into a mainstream one. When you have a look at the charts in Austria, you mainly find podcasts that are about geopolitics, daily news, politics. Has this always been the case? Or is it due to maybe a growing concern about the current political situation in Europe?
Yes, for sure, it's part. I think it depends on certain current affairs or developments. But in general, the podcast usage is very much with history and true crime. It's very much with news. That's basically the core themes or topics. We still have like as in Germany as well. We still have a majority of podcasts that are based on conversations.
Yes, that's popular everywhere.
Storytelling. Exactly. So yeah, I think it's we don't have a very specific or individual kind of development in terms of the podcasting industry, and also that news now are leading is not very specific to the days or weeks or months we are in now in terms of politics and international affairs.
As I was saying before during the introduction, you share this common market with this audience with Germany. How do you manage to grow and at the same time differentiate yourselves from the German podcast industry? I mean, does Germany and the presence of Germany damage you, or does it favor the podcast industry in Austria?
So, it's not as easy in terms of to reach a whole language market as someone would assume, because there's still dialects.
Yeah,
and
sure.
As soon as a certain podcast has a kind of a labeling towards one dialect or to be Austrian, it's already kind of labeled towards the Austrian market. So it's not so easy to produce a podcast from Austria towards the whole German-speaking market.
Okay.
It like the more specific the topic, the more niche, the easier to reach the whole German-speaking market. The more general and mainstream, the less easy it is to reach the whole German-speaking market. That said, it's very difficult. Like Austria is a small market. If you're lucky, if you're doing a good job, if you're doing a specific targeting of the German-speaking market in total, you will be lucky. In terms of ad revenue within Austria, I think there are around 10 podcasts that have their reach just within Austria and make a serious amount of money. And the most important or successful Austrian podcasts is one about history, and they with doing a podcast on history, they can quite succeed in both countries, and they're good business. So, but then you have, of course, the news podcast that necessarily just focus on the national market, and then the reach is very limited.
Yeah, there is definitely a way to make the best out of this shared border and language, but as you say, if you want to focus on the things that are currently happening in Austria, you're kind of canceling that opportunity to reach the German market. Even though I believe that obviously there in Germany, as you share this your language, there will be people that will listen to you and are obviously interested in whatever is happening in Austria, but they won't be as such a wide audience as in the other case you were telling. How would you describe in Austria? How is the average podcast listener there? Are they mostly male or female? Are they younger? How is the podcast listener in your country?
So since we are a small country, we don't have so much numbers and statistics on our own. We very much relate on statistics that are and surveys that are done in Germany. As I mentioned, there's a digital news report from Reuters, and that's the most reliable number regarding podcast usage. But in general, if I look at the numbers we are getting from OMR, which is a marketing and podcasting company in Hamburg, and they do a report each year. And as far as I know, it's very similar to Austria, so that we have the main group of listeners is below 25, and it kind of goes step by step towards 55 plus. So you really have like the most of the people are the young ones, 18 to 25, then a bit less towards the next age group, and it goes down to 55 plus. But still, that's basically it. We have a very clear profile in terms of true crime, where it's tendentially more female listenership, and we have politics with a bit more male-ish listenership. But yeah.
And what improvements do you need as a podcast creator in Austria for your industry there to be truly developed and improve? You were talking about how you want to grow and grow your industry there in Austria. So what improvements do you expect from the future of podcasting there in Austria?
Yeah, I don't expect. I try to work on it. So I think very much important is that the media as such is even bigger, so by every media company using it, like newspaper and so on. For Austria, it would be also very important that the public radio is allowed to produce podcast only. So right now there's a law in terms of what the public radio is are allowed to produce, and right now they just publish their radio shows as podcasts. But like the amount of podcast productions and the importance and relevance of the podcast productions would raise if there would be such a big player as the Austrian Public Radio to produce podcast only or online only audio content.
Yeah, like native podcast, right? Not only the radio show uploaded as a podcast.
Exactly. Right now, by law, they are not allowed to, which is stupid, I would say, and it hinders the development of the podcasting.
Yeah, especially if they are, and they could be the biggest player there. I think
exactly. So this is one element that the Austrian public radio should be able to produce native podcasts, online content only, as they call it, and. Then there is talent, of course. So right now, for us as a company, it's still kind of difficult to find proper talent. That's as well for producing on the technical and audio side, as well as writers and journalists who are natively educated and experienced, and also in terms of their private usage, natively connected to the medium of podcasts. So in terms of talent, there is a big need for good people.
Yeah, I think that will be just a matter of time, just as well. Regarding that law you were talking about, we'll definitely keep an eye and an ear on those improvements to see where can go the podcasting industry in Austria. And Milo, before we end this episode, I would like to ask you two more questions. These are about your listening habits. First of all, what's your favorite podcast right now?
My favorite podcast for years is The Journal. From the Wall Street Journal. It comes 3-4 times a week, and it's produced with between Spotify and the Wall Street Journal. I listen to almost all of them each week.
And when's your favorite moment to listen to podcasts, Milo?
And I'm listening very unstructured and unregularly, mainly by walking. So I don't have a commute ways because I'm very close to my office and my home. So I don't have a lot of time between to listen. So if I do a longer walk, or if I do training like fitness or whatever, I listen to it. I listen to podcasts. Yeah.
Milo Tesselaar, founder and owner of Oh Wow Podcast. Thanks a lot for being here in this episode of Sounds Like Europe.
Thank you also very much for doing this and for having invited me.
And to everyone listening to this interview, I've been your host, Javi Caminero. Thank you for doing so, and I hope you come back in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Sounds Like Europe, Cross-Border Podcasting is a WePod podcast funded by the Creative Europe programme. Hosted and written by Javi Caminero, sound design by Manu Tomillo, coordinator Alexander Damiano Ricci, executive producer Anna Ribera.